Hello, good afternoon. Well, good afternoon if you are in Europe in the morning, if you are in California, like Rashid, and all sorts of time zones that we're covering right now that due to COVID, we are transitioning online and we are all learning all sorts of new things. In my case, my name is Marta. I am the founder of Garage Stories, which we just prepared our first online education course. It was a first time for us translating all of our tools and knowledge into an online format. And also the first time that I'm here with Rashid. And it's a great honor to have you here because you're actually my main source of inspiration when I did start with Garage Stories back in 2016. I actually remember that I think the first time I hear you speak about VR and all these sorts of new emerging media was 16 November 2016 at Google headquarters, and it was truly mind blowing. So I am really happy that you had the time and the opportunity to join us to share all all the insights and learnings and also failures when you are taking the venture actually to explore and in a way build a language for a medium that so far it still doesn't have this this language that even you can create good or bad stories. If you are working with known mediums, you sort of have some sort of rules and tools to follow. But when you're working with a completely blank page, this is quite more challenging but also way more exciting. And just to give a quick overview about Garage Stories and my background before moving on to your experience, which is amazing and super inspiring. So Garage Stories was born with this philosophy. I come from the film industry and I had been running co-creation film festivals for a few years. And then I moved to Silicon Valley and I discovered all these emerging technologies and I was completely mind blown. Not only for what I saw, which was already impressive, that was by 2016, but also by all the possibilities that I imagine in how could we expand stories and create new worlds and new experiences that could connect with people in a deeper and more meaningful way. So the whole premise behind starting Garage Stories, which actually started in a garage in Silicon Valley in a hacker house I was living, it was a garage quite similar to this one. And the whole premise was that I was seeing that there was a lot of people that was interested in emerging forms of media, but all the research was way more focused in tech, also because we're talking about Silicon Valley, and also because all the research was done in closed groups. So there was like a lot of small labs, but they were always sort of the same people and working on a specific project. So Garage Stories was born with the idea to create a playground, like in a way, a white label innovation lab for people from different backgrounds to come together and explore how can we actually tell stories, and not only this, but which stories are native and unique to this medium. So it was never meant to, it was never born with the philosophy to be an education platform, but actually with the philosophy to be this playground where could create the right atmosphere for people to feel that it was fine to fail, it was fine to make mistakes, because the whole goal was to actually push the boundaries and try to explore and discover where these mediums could take us to. So actually the time we met, in my case, I was doing my first prototype. That's what you do, right, when you start any new project. So I had this assumption that a lot of people should be interested in getting together with people that they hadn't met before, that they had like very different skills to them, because the idea was to make storytellers with designers, with developers, with architects, with all sorts of different profiles that were seeing the potentialities of this medium to get together, be formed in multidisciplinary teams, and play with the possibilities of this medium to explore how we could create that stories. And and also during, like, this was, I think, 3 years ago that we did the first workshop. It was in 2017. So it's already been 3 years, and we've been organizing quite some labs and workshops. Initially, our idea was to have a physical space where we could actually open the doors to the creative community, because another thing that we thought is that it was actually quite expensive to access these technologies. It was like that was like a barrier for people to actually start and exploring with that. So the idea was to get all the big tech companies to provide us with the latest gadgets, so we could open these garage for the community, so we could have like a wider large amount of brains actually exploring these technologies and these gadgets to come up with way more ideas that were being developed. And always Garage Stories was focused on the storytelling side of it, not so much on the technology. We thought that with the current development of the technology, there was already a lot of things that could be explored. And just before I wrap it up and we move it on to you, the course we have put together for Build Tool is a compilation of the best tools and practices that we've developed all over these years. As I said, it's the first time that we are doing these online. And so our philosophy is all the opposite to dogmatic. We don't come here to tell you this is how you do it. What we have developed actually is a series of tools that help you ask the right questions and understand some of the key elements of VR stories, so you can make decisions on your own or as a creator on why you want to use it and how. So our tools are tailored to help you understand this medium, make these right questions, and based on that, make your own decisions to build your story. And of course, we have two formats, one which you can take at your own pace, and another one which is blended format, which means that each chapter has an exercise, because what we aim is that at the end of all the chapters, you finish your first VR story. So the blended format has different key points where we actually organize a Zoom call with all the participants, maximum up to 15. So we can discuss the different stories that are being built, so we can sort of discuss how is it going, and also like give feedback, so you can be more confident on the project that you are building. So that's it. And now I am super excited. Actually, before we start the interview, I would love to share with all of you the first garage stories that we ever organized, that where Rachid took part of it. And it has, we have evolved and a lot of things. And of course, like it's been 3 years, we've been like developing and refining the methodology. But I think it contains very well the vibe and the atmosphere that we wanted to create, where it was like a playground where you could actually come and play and try and fail and eventually come up with really good ideas. So let me share this video. Okay.
You may not be presenting. I don't think the video is presented. You want to play it again?
It's not playing?
No. I think you maybe if you present first or share your screen, because it wasn't sharing.
Right. So it didn't play at all, the video?
The screen wasn't shared.
Okay, so we'll try to fix that for later. Sorry. So, okay. Okay. So we'll try to fix that for later. Sorry. Live. That's what happens. So, Rachid, let's move on to you. I think maybe if you want to give like a quick introduction about yourself.
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? Am I coming through okay?
Yeah,
Good.
I can see that.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay. Well, first, obviously, thank you all. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this interesting event, and thank you, Marta, for pulling me in, and thank you for everything you've done throughout the years. I've had the joy of watching Garage Stories, as you said, starting from the beginning and all the way to where you are now, and I'm super impressed with everything that you guys have been doing, and it's nice to be part of that early family of Garage Stories. So I'm really excited about where you guys are going. So I'm Rachid El Guerrab, and I'm an engineer by training, and previously worked in games and mobile tech and all sorts of things that are sort of related to both graphics, video, and then entertainment in general. And the last project that sort of allowed us to meet was obviously Spotlight Stories, which was at Google, and where I got to play more and work more with the film side of entertainment, unlike the gaming side. Which then launched me into a whole new life in a way, with storytelling and going a little bit more into the depths of how the interplay between new technologies and the 1,000 years old art of telling stories, and how does it evolve over time, and how can it be just a little tiny bit of that story maybe. And that's pretty much what I've been doing, at least for the last 10 years almost.
So it seems that you have a pretty technical background. So from your studies and your first early jobs. So I find it really interesting the way that I feel that maybe you approach storytelling, or actually maybe the way you got into it, because I feel that when you're working with immersive media, in a sort of way, you have to engineer plays and stories and characters. So how do you tackle this challenge when you actually started working with a completely new medium that you had no past reference probably?
Yeah, I mean, my background was definitely engineering and specifically graphics, but I worked in games, and you worked for Ubisoft and Sony and other companies, and over time, games are kind of like the garage of entertainment at that lifetime, which was in the 90s at least, and maybe in the 80s even. And it was already a lot of times small teams, mixed between artists, designers, writers sometimes, and engineers. And so I always loved that kind of team mix, because I don't like to work in a space where it's only engineers, because I just love art. I can't do anything. I can't draw anything. All I can do is help artists produce good art. And so I've always loved that interaction in games. And already in sort of my gaming career, I worked on some parts of character design, or some parts of character programming and level programming that were close to design. So you always had to work with an artist or a designer and try to figure out, how does a scene play, how does a moment play, how does it feel to the person who's playing it. And that really was kind of the beginning of being interested in really characters and overall stories within the space where there is a player, there is a user, there's a viewer that also can act in a way. And then obviously with Spotlight Stories, the story is very different. We decided from the beginning in a way to work with filmmakers. And as much as I thought that my background would be a huge bump, but it was actually a whole new field. And I realized how much even within gaming, how much it's very different than film and what the priorities are and how people think about it. And so it's really just, even though I'm an engineer, it's just the desire of wanting to do something really good. And then you do whatever you need to do. And you realize it's all communication anyways with people. And if you are just open-minded enough and you can find the interest in it, it can open doors that you wouldn't think of when you start your career in some path. I found myself, writing stories in the last couple of years, doing writing, directing, giving notes on artwork and things that I would never have thought ever I would be able to do. But when there's a good team and when, as I said, there's open-mindedness and you really are all there just to make something really good, and you just apply to it, it works.
And I always like to ask this question. What was your aha moment when you thought, okay, VR, there is something in it that I want to explore more?
Well, the story of Spotlight Stories kind of started with a little bit before this new rebirth of VR, when the Oculus team was bought by Facebook and there was all these announcements. In fact, we were working on our first story, Windy Day, I think at the moment where John Carmack, who ended up being the CTO of Oculus, had moved from id to VR and gave a lot of credibility, at least in the techie world, that there is some new stuff happening in VR technology that makes this guy go, leave his normal life and go into a new one. And it was really, we started with mostly mobile at the time. There was no headsets or anything. And
which year?
This is 2000, late 2012, beginnings of 2013 is when we were working already on Windy Day. And the whole point there, we were part of a company called Motorola that was owned by Google. And the challenge really was to do interesting, let's say, content or films or stories, short stories, but made for mobile. And it was only through a sort of a kind of a user design centric approach that we bumped into, to be honest, this idea of let's make something where the virtual world is around you and you're in it. And so it was interesting that this later kind of fit nicely with VR and where things were with VR, and then 360 video and everything that happened after. But the whole point of our experience was, okay, if everybody has mobile phones, but everybody is watching content that wasn't made for mobile phones, that was made for big TV screens and theater. And so if we were to make some type of movies, some type of stories that only worked on a mobile phone, made for it, took advantage of it, but also is given to everyone, because at the time already there's billions of people that have these, from the 95 years olds to the 2-year-olds. And so, games and all of these things are usually very segmented and whatnot, and people don't necessarily all go to that kind of content. So we said, even in terms of interaction, what would be the easiest way that somebody could move in this gaming world that we made? People are used to touch and scroll and all that stuff. We wanted something interesting that actually could almost only be done in a phone. And the idea was, well, we already take pictures with our phones and we take videos and we just point the camera and do it. So we're used to this. So what if we do the same thing, use the sensors and everything, but instead of you seeing the real world behind the phone, what you're looking at is the world of the story, and you're sort of inside of the story. And, you know, it was a stupid idea, but it worked. It was fun. And we started kind of, you know, there's tech, of course, and it's hard and all that, but that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was, how does the story work then if you are basically giving the camera to the viewer? And then as VR, kind of the whole sort of immersive tech started happening, and before that, a little bit of Google Glass and other things that were happening at the same time, it just fit. I mean, Google really started out with VR with cardboard, if you remember, and I think it was in I/O of 2014, I remember, I think. And that was just, okay, take that same mobile phone that we created a story for you where you can move like this, put it on your face in the cardboard, and now you can move using your head. And so it just, for us, was a nice fit for this idea. And then, of course, once you move with tech a little bit to the point where you really are inside and everything is blocked from around you, then you realize, okay, this is a whole new world now. This was a word as well, and this is fun too. But there's a whole other feeling the moment you take over people's senses in some way, and you say, okay, no, I'm taking over, but you're inside. Now what do we do? And all the challenges that we dealt with before just got multiplied by hundreds, and that was the beginning of the fun.
Yeah, because like even if you are making a non-interactive immersive video, by default, just by being in the middle of it, you feel some sort of responsibility. You need to understand, just beyond the fact that you are just looking everywhere, trying to figure out what's more interesting for you or where should you go, like this FOMO feeling. It is also that you feel some sense of responsibility, and you need to understand who you are in this world. And one thing I remember from that talk is that you had this big, massive Excel with all these like squares with all the actions and characters and so on. Can you tell us a bit more about how did you come up with that Excel, and how, first of all, how did you structure it? Was it something that you use in all the projects, and how will you evaluate how easy it was for someone to understand that?
I think the first few projects that we did, we started with Windy Day with sort of a Pixar team with Jan Pinkova as director, and then we moved to Duet with Glenn Keane. All those were for mobile mostly. Then we moved to Justin Lin with sort of like 360 video, giant cameras, and so on. All those first 4 projects were just exploring first technically, how does this work? User interaction, how could it possibly work? And then what are the problems of putting stories? And it was really good that we worked with different directors, because we always picked, you know, people that were interested but also skeptical of what we're trying to do. And so they cared really about their stories coming out really good. They don't care that it's like this tech or that tech necessarily. They really want good stuff, good stories that work for people. And so they each had really hard requirements on how this could work. We couldn't just do anything. It wasn't a prototype that we were making. It had to be a final product that they could put their name on it. And so there was just even a little bit of figuring out what the space is. And then once we started seeing the space, quickly, of course, we're in Silicon Valley, so people go very quickly into like, okay, how does this become a platform? How does it become a tool? How does it become? And so I actually remember the conversation in the cafeteria at Motorola with Jan Pinkova, who's our creative director. And like, do you think we can make tools that artists can just use to stitch stories like this? Do you think it's something we can give to others, or something that at least we can put in some form that we can scale the ability of how many stories and what the variety of stories we can make. And it was hard in the beginning because even us, we didn't understand completely what it is that we were doing exactly. But it started kind of forming up a little bit of what is a scene, how did we move between scenes, how did we control the camera, controlling the camera, of course, in the sense that how did we respond to what people did, how did we control animation, how did we control characters, what's the decision making every time based on how people interact with the stories. And so we started building kind of a prototype tool that would almost rebuild parts of the stories that we've already done through just, coding in a sense, into some sort of format that would be approachable, at least by others. And so when we were doing those presentations at that time, we already had a variety of studios. There was Aardman, Nexus Studios, maybe others, who we already went through the process with them, where we said, okay, you don't have to start from the beginning. You don't have to code anything. We have this language that we sort of came up with, and it maps to a lot of things that we've done already. You go ahead and use it, and we'll hold your hands through it, and we'll evolve it as you're doing stuff. So it was like, we were using all these wonderful creators doing different stories, many of them, in evolving the language and the tools as we go. And I think that variety is what helps the most, because we kind of saw very quickly, I think we went from like one story in 1 year, then maybe 2, then maybe 3, then suddenly we had 5, and I think in like 2016 there were maybe 10 projects at once or 12 projects at once, and it was just exploded because we were starting to get comfortable with what we could tell people to do.
And so I actually remember that the short film Parent was actually a nominee for the Oscars, right?
Yes.
How was this? Was a special category, or how did that happen?
At the time, there wasn't a special category for anything outside of the normal. So Pearl was the first show where we produced, I think, 5 to 6 different formats of the show. There was mobile, 360 video, linear 2D, normal VR, Gear VR-ish or cardboard VR, and then full room scale VR. And we had to, we both kind of campaigned in a sense with the committees and the people that we know that might know judges and so on, and seeing the full VR version, but we couldn't submit anything but the 2D version, and that's what ended up being nominated. But it was kind of a hard battle. I think Annie's, we were also the first ones in the Annie's, which is the award for animation, to submit something on a phone and get people to judge it, which was really strange, and send phones to people, and it was good days.
So I think this gives perfect ground for my next question, which is, if that piece was like done in different formats, was it like part of a transmedia strategy, or was basically the same story in different formats? And this leads to my actual question, which is, which stories do you think that are native to VR and need to be done in VR, and they work way better for the audience rather than in 2D?
Yeah, that was, I think, the primary question that we always asked throughout those years, for like 7 or 8 years that we did this project, and up to now I ask the same question, like, why is this a story that needs to be consumed in this specific media, whether it's VR or AR or anything? And I think the point really was, when you're talking to people who are used to making normal films and so on, of course, there's a big barrier to go over before they can sort of open up. and think of other things. And then suddenly people also kind of run wild in their imagination of what's possible with technology. And then you say, no, 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 it's actually just this space here. And a lot of times, I think the natural thing for people to say is the experience of being there. That there's something in the story in which the physical experience of being inside the environment is interesting, which really translates to the physical space of the story. A lot of our stories, or this good bunch of them, are kind of in a space like the car in Pearl, or the special delivery, which was the Aardman one, is this kind of like space where you're on one side of apartment complex and you can see all these apartments all around you. Rain or Shine, which was with Nexus, you're in the center of a little town square. So that's the thing that comes naturally, which is, oh, I want to be in there. And then there's the, how wonderful it would be if I'm at that space, getting the feeling that potentially some imaginary character would get if they were right at that moment. And that's mostly what people were comfortable going through. The interesting question still is, well, how is that first qualitatively interesting, or is that much better than me kind of controlling the camera and giving you the right framing and so on? And two, once you're in there, you're going to want to do things, interact with things, even if it's just looking around. How do we really make you feel like you're there? Are you a character in the story? Do you have to be? Is there meaning to you doing something in the story that has more depth than your normal kind of watching a movie? And that's the question that's always been kind of tricky and sort of hard for a lot of people, because it's very hard for people to say after 100 years of doing film, why am I doing a close-up, or why am I doing a first-person view of this? It takes a lot of thinking to kind of go through all that knowledge and then pull it out and then say, okay, in this new format, what does it mean to interact with the story? What does it mean that you're this close to a character versus that close? And a lot of things actually we learned from seeing what people said once they experienced a VR story. In Pearl, for example, there were people that said the story felt different. And just for people who don't know Pearl, you're basically it's a story of a dad and his daughter. Dad wants to play music. His daughter ends up being the talented one. But they're in a car, and it's kind of like a travel through time. And as they grow older, and you're with them in this car, and you see the words through the car windows. And the car space is really great. And Patrick, just like everybody else, just thought, Children of Men, that scene when you're in the car and they're getting shot at, for people who know the movie, that's a great scene, and it was shot actually almost in 360. I want that feeling in a car. And so started with space. But then people said things like, if I sit in the passenger seat next to the dad, the story feels different. Like I'm almost a parent, and I'm looking at the kids behind me, and I'm almost like, some people thought they were the dead mother spirit. There were all this kind of imagination they would give to who they are. And then they would say, but then if I moved back in the car seat and I'm sitting next to the daughter and the dad is driving over there, then I feel like I'm the brother. I'm one of the kids. And it reminds me of my family trips when, we would travel, let's say, and take a road trip. And so there's so much more meaning to these things of just where you are and what are you doing, and how, even if the character ever looks at you, if the character ever, if they turn off the light and you're left by yourself in a dark room, what does that mean? And so the stories that can pull on that, to answer your question that you had, the stories that have some sort of desire to use the fact that you're either there or you're interacting or you're maybe changing the course, maybe not, of what happens, are the stories that I think fit really well, because people have a deeper, more interesting experience. If people experience Pearl in room scale versus mobile, no matter how much they cried when they saw the 2D, they say this is different. This is different. And so I think that's where we're still going after. Why is it different? What does it mean? And then we'll see an explosion of people who take advantage of those new kind of facilities.
Well, I see that an interesting discussion is going on the chat. So after, we will have time for questions. So if you already have some questions, like, start writing them down. And one thing I wanted to say is that about present, right? Because I guess the question is dual. One thing is present. I think we will agree that all the uniqueness of VR can be summed up with this characteristic present, like, you're essentially in there. So it's a matter of, why do you need the user to be present? Because I think it's relevant that the audience understands why they are there, because otherwise it just becomes like a bit of annoying and you just don't know where to look or what to do. And another thing is, like, how do you keep this present? Because I remember that, for example, in the piece Rain or Shine, like, the story will stop unless you were looking at what you wanted me to look. So I guess it's always like a hard decision on how do I make it easy for my audience to follow the story without breaking the sense that this is real. And also from the lab that we did at Silicon Valley, the first one we did, we actually used a very interesting tool to prototype, which was Immersive Theater. So essentially, the 4 pieces that each team create, there were like 5-minute pieces, and each story happened in a very different location. I think we had the hairdresser, a yoga studio, a wine bar, and another space. So afterwards, when they recorded it, then we invited people to enter the spaces where the story was recreated live for them. And we did that so as to validate if the assumptions on the user behavior of the audience was what the creators envision or not. And there was like a lot of interesting insights. One of them was a story that had a lot of dialogue and a lot of actors, and there was like a lot of things going on. And what people did is that they moved to the corner because they felt really uncomfortable, that they didn't understood why they were inside the room, because it was like really violent for them. But then we had another experience in the wine bar, where people was essentially invited to enter the bar, and there was like a lot of actors spread across the beer garden, the wine garden, sorry, whatever it's called. And so essentially people could like just stand up wherever they wanted, and they could engage on the random conversations of the actors. And this one worked really well, and actually people was getting really close to actors, because I think in a way they managed to create a space on their own. So I guess also what I'm trying to say, that it's way harder to make VR work when you're trying to create a linear story, a story that has like a strong narrative.
Yes. Yes. And, somewhat no as well, because there's a difference kind of between what do you want to do. Let's say you want to do a linear story, or you're doing stories because you have a point that you're trying to make. And usually that's made in a certain way, and it's kind of in any ways, as my friend Jan would say, we live life in a linear way. It just might be your linear life in that story is different than mine. Your memory of it, your experience of it is different, but you are going to have a linear path through it, and I'm going to have a linear path through it. And all we do in these kind of sort of let's say interactive stories in general or immersive is that we're giving you your own linear story, your own memory of that, let's say that film or that moment. That's your own, but you are living it in a linear way. You're doing one thing after another. And we used to say that all the interactive work that we did with the tech and so on were first there to fix the problem of being in an immersive space. Because, as you said, the moment you're in, what are you looking at? What do you pay attention to? Where do you direct your people? Almost naturally want to know what to do, and they naturally want to sort of know that they're doing the right thing and that they're not messing up. And you see it a lot of times with people, like just that you put a VR device on and they're just sitting there because they think, maybe this is what I need to do, even though they can look, and this is actually sometimes the dangers between testing your experiences or your stories with experienced VR people from the kind of groups of people that we work with versus the normal people out there who haven't, are not used to it. Because we all make assumptions that, like, okay, if you put somebody in a headset, they'll be looking around and they'll try to touch things. Not everybody behaves that way, and testing is so important in making sure that you always get people fresh onto this thing. And thank God there's a lot still, that you will learn so much by just seeing how people behave. And one of those is, where should I be looking? What's interesting? Well, you're going to tell me because you just put an explosion right here, or you turned on a light, or stagecraft, theatercraft, all those things kind of come back. That's why I usually don't like hearing people that say, well, we're rethinking everything from scratch and we don't know anything. No, there's been a lot of people that have been doing stuff like this for a long time. People who create park experiences, park rides, big shows where they 360 shows in a way. And if you go and watch those, you'll see that craft. Here's how they get your attention. They measure, for example, if some actor jumps from one platform, how long does it take him to get to the other platform? Is that too fast for people to follow? Is that too slow? All of these elements are part of the stagecraft that you have to put together so that people get the point of your story. They don't feel lost. People always think that, because this is VR and they can do whatever they want, I'm not doing a linear story and I need to just like make them play and give them an open word box thing.
Yeah.
That's not really, that works for maybe like a small percentage of people, but that's not really interesting for most people. What's interesting is they have a good experience and then they felt like they were free to look or to do things. They felt like it, but they still want a really well-crafted experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody had tried the show called Sleep No More, which is sort of like a big famous show in New York that's sort of like a branching story, but you're in an environment and you're in this building and you have a mask on. And we went to it, I remember a few years ago, and they have this kind of similar problem that we're talking about, which is you go into the story, you're in this building and you're told, something is happening. And there's so much detail. So for people that are all trying to say, we need more realistic, volumetric video so that we can get all the details so people can feel, okay, so here's a place where it's a real place. They put so much detail. It's really fantastic work of like creating an environment. But then at the end, I didn't feel like I got a great story. And it's because, either because there's a lot of people and you don't know where to go, or you don't know what actors to follow, and suddenly you're walking and there's a scene happening, and like, was this related to that? Or you go into a room and there's all these sort of artifacts on the walls, and you're like, maybe I'm supposed to read this puzzle and figure out what does this mean for the story. I'm sure if you have like hundreds of hours there, you'd probably get everything out of it. But in a couple hours, you're bombarded with content in a way.
Yeah.
A lot of it seems like it's at the same level of interest, and you don't really know, what am I supposed to do here? And so it works sometimes for those experiences. Some people like them, but it's important for people, especially who want to create things that reach a broader audience, to always think, okay, what is, and of course testing is much better than thinking it yourself, but you still have to think, okay, I'm going to give a good experience to these people. I'm giving them a linear experience. It's going to be linear, whether you like it or not. And then, how do I give them that optionality and freedom that makes them feel like they're there, but at the same time, it makes them feel handled. People don't like to be lost.
Yeah.
We had this little butterfly that everybody loved in Duet, because Duet is a story that happens kind of all around you, but it's this drawings that you follow. And we had this little butterfly that shows up if you're lost for too long, and it just flies. And if you follow it, it takes you back to where the story will continue properly. And for people, it just felt like, this makes sense in the context of the space that I'm watching and the story that I'm watching. It's not some gamey thing. It's not a thing that blocks your view or tells you, okay, you need to go left. But it helps people feel comfortable, taken care of. And that's important.
Yeah. So one thing that's for sure is like, because I'm also reading a little bit like in the corner of my eye, the conversation. So I think what actually got me excited about getting into this and opening this lab is like, there is so much freedom that actually is not about trying to guess what's right or what's wrong. It's like understanding your options, how it works, and then as a creator making choices, right? Because there is ways where you can actually guide audience attention much more, but you're also maybe trading some more presence instead. So it's just about like making these decisions. And one system that has worked quite well in making these decisions is assuming that it's always going to be a betting system. You're never going to get it right for 100 users. You're just aiming for the higher percentage of users that are going to behave or enjoy the story in the way you envision it, cool, or in a way that's enjoyable for them. And I would like you to tell us a bit about your new company. Well, not so new, right? I think you've already been running it for a couple or 3 years.
Yes.
So what are you focusing on and so?
Oh, you're cutting off a little bit. One sec.
Okay.
Oh, could you ask again? You were just cutting off a little bit.
Sorry. So yeah, I was asking about your company.
Yeah.
That I believe you have been running for the last 2 years. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how do you?
Sure.
How are you working in the VR ecosystem? What's your vision? Also, a little bit going into the future, because I guess when you run your own company, this is a question that's continuously on your mind, right? Like, where are we going to?
Yeah, and sort of we started at a point where with Spotlight Stories, we sort of got to a point where we had a format, we had a way of doing projects, and we had a certain kind of objectives set, in the sense that we've reached the point where we can release new stories, and it's kind of became similar. But there were other areas that I felt were deeper, that needed to be explored, and some of them are we talking about here, which is, why are we doing this, and what is this really, and how does this really connect to kind of almost the beginning of film in some sense, in film language. There's a lot of similarities, of course. Back then, I used to say that, when people say interactive stories, almost all stories were interactive before. We only stopped being interactive when we started printing things on a film and then playing it exactly the same way. But before that, actors are on stage. Some are more controlled, some are more open, and people used to kind of change their stories every week and sometimes every day, sometimes every hour, in those stories they tell in big old places in all these old cities, street theater. And so what changed was film came in with a variety of technologies, and then after 3, maybe 30, 40 years, finally settled on, like, okay, here's what editing is, here's what close-up is, here's what camera movements and so on. And we kind of felt like that needs to be done on a deeper level. And also it felt like there's all these domains, whether it's VR, AR, but even interactive TV, narrative stories in games, people doing stories with voice machines like Siri and Google Assist and so on. Everybody's exploring this kind of space where stories are now dynamic and they're not linear.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like there was a language that even extended out of VR. VR is a big part where it evolved because it was exciting. But there's this whole language, yet there was no way for creators, especially on the writing side, but sometimes on other stages as well, for really thinking about, where do I start? How do I write my story? And so we branched off and started a startup, and we've been working on tools, as well as experimenting with content, in a sense, that has some exploration of what does it mean for you to be part of the story, and how do you write it, and how do you develop it, and also what fails before. I have this sort of theory about the amount of logic thinking that you employ when you're watching a film versus the amount of emotional interaction with the film.
Mm-hmm.
I always say that films are really interactive experiences in your head. The person who set up the scenario and the person who set up the editing and so on, all they're doing is interacting with you. And as you're watching something that's really engaging, in your head, you're constantly, or maybe with someone next to you, you're going like, I know that's the guy. I know this is what's going to, wait, no, I always expected that. And so that's like a craft, right? That's the setup. Those are it's similar to game design in a sense. Those are charts that some storyteller somewhere set up, and some editor with the director worked on late nights to say, no, we're not going to tell you about this until about this moment. This feels right. And when you watch a really engaging film, you're so into it, your whole brain is engaged, but somehow you're never really at the level where you were solving puzzles yourself, in the sense where it takes you out of the story. You're still scared, you're still in love, you're still crying, but you're also thinking. And that space, to me, partly is because the experience is so well driven that you're passive in some way. And so there's a space, I think, and we did it with Spotlight. The idea was, we never tell you this is interactive. We always tell you, just be in it. Here you go. And it's where you're looking. Mm-hmm. We never ask you, okay, do you want to branch to this story or that story? No, you're just there. You're following your curiosity, and you're following your own desire of seeing things. And so that's the space that's interesting to me, in terms of something that I think still has the same impact, emotional impact, the same hit that you would get from a film, while not really pulling people out and telling them, okay, now choose your own adventure, be careful, you might not get the right one, etc., etc. And that's what we've been really working on. It's both tools and sort of developing stories where we're experimenting with these ideas. And there's many more, there's things about like, what's our responsibility when you're almost ethical, I would say, but what is your responsibility when you pull somebody in a story and you tell them they have a choice, but maybe they didn't have that much choice? How do they feel about that? What's their state of mind as they're playing something that may be really important or feels important, but yet they have choices, and so on. And there's a whole area, and I feel like it's just starting. I mean, it's hard, it's exciting, and there's a large amount of people, thank God, that are all experimenting and working on this.
Yeah, like this could be like endless, because I mean, we could be talking about that forever. There is so much to explore and so much to be discovering, and
Yep.
so many layers. And actually, one of the questions that I'm reading, I think let's start taking some questions. It's from John, and he's actually asking about complexity. Don't know if you can read it, but he's saying, "You're one of the world experts in VR storytelling. What are the challenges of managing the complexity of designing interactive experiences, and how stories change in development?"
Yes. Well, the there is something to always keep in mind, which is that every degree of flexibility, if we're talking in almost engineering language, every degree of flexibility we give to the interaction adds an order of magnitude of complexity to what you're doing. That's just a fact of life. And so if you're sitting there watching a 2D film, there's not much flexibility you have. You're being fed exactly what you're watching, and so there's a lot more control that can be put together in that film. When you even talk about something that's episodic versus one shot, well, in an episodic film, you obviously have the choice of not watching the next episode. You have the choice of watching it the next day or the next month. And so how does the creator deal with it? And you go from there. When we did just the simple degree of freedom of moving your camera in a almost very simple 360 way, it's not even in space, that added so much more complexity to what we're doing. And it's kind of like also the tale of people that are yearning for more technology that would let us talk to actors, that would let us touch things, that would let us throw things inside of a space and so on. Well, it could work in some places and it is done really well. But every one of those things that we add could be so exciting, but so complex to think about if you're trying to just control the space. And that's not, again, to say that you have to give people exactly the same story the way you want it to tell. It's just, you're just trying to give them a good experience. And when you're every bit of flexibility means a lot more thinking into how do I deal with it so that people are not pulled out of the environment and suddenly I sold them a bill of goods. Like I sold them, hey, you can talk with characters, and then they walk into some extra, let's say they can, and they walk into the extra and they can't talk. And then it just takes them out. I hope that answers the question.
Here I can see another one, which asks about, don't you think the real challenge is not branch narrative, but characters' interaction with the user?
Well, I mean, character interaction can be seen as branching in a sense, because if a character says one thing or the other, that's a branch. Maybe it's a mini branch, maybe it's one of a million branches that are possible. At the end of the day, there's some branching, whether it's procedurally generated, or it's written by some writer, or actually a character played by somebody else. There are issues that are specific to character design where stories fall apart sometimes when they are interactive. And I've seen a lot of this in interactive TV stories, is that characters are built with certain features in a way. They have choices, they have dilemmas, they have the they make. And so what happens when you make those choices for them? That's a big question, and it's the thing that sometimes falls apart in games as well, in narrative games, and they kind of get around it with cutscenes and so on, and various ways. But in games, there's a proposition there that what we're selling you is fun. When you try to do something that's deeper stories, they're really driven. Those are the stories of characters. Characters have a thing that makes you interested in them. And so, but there are solutions to this. There are ways of writing stories where you don't necessarily make choices for characters, yet you are an agent in a sense in the story. And of course, there's different levels and there's a spectrum of how much you affect the story. But there are ways that you can be deep into kind of the universe and be part of it, but without breaking the design of the characters, without breaking the rules that make stories actually interesting. And those are the kind of stuff that we also work on all the time, is how do you play this thing where characters are interesting, the story is interesting, it's always interesting no matter what path you take, and you can still give people a personal experience.
Cool. Next question is about sound. How deep goes the importance of sound as a storytelling layer in building immersive experiences?
I love this question because in almost every presentation I've done about this, the sound is always the last thing that people ask about and talk about. And we never have enough time for sound. Of course, sound is maybe more important than visuals in telling, stories probably in general. But in my experience with these sort of immersive interactive stories, sound is really the life of the experience of being immersed. I could, probably tell a fantastically engaging story, and you'd be in it completely without any visuals, but all in sound. And sound is, obviously a big part of the stage design and a big part of how do you even perceive the environment you're in. And it really drives the visuals. And we know obviously now that sound actually in your brain actually tells you what you're looking at. In a sense, it can change what you're looking at perceptually just in how the sound is played. So of course, 100% important. It is a 360 sound. Thank goodness that people in the 70s also made some technologies that we can piggyback on and create interesting 360 sound that is getting closer and closer to getting you to feel really immersed. There's a lot to do in tech, but there's already enough to do interesting stuff. And we've always, in every project, and I'm sure especially people that do animation that are not actually shooting real film, know that in every project almost, all the way until the moment where we add sound, it's one experience, and then it's a whole new universe the moment we get sound design in and the moment we're really immersed. And then it's
So
also, of course, the stage where... Oh, go ahead.
No, because like there is Ziet who's asking something in this line. He says, will you say that sound is what makes the story believable?
Well, I mean, there's obviously various level of what makes the story believable, but sound is a big part of it. Yeah, well, at least it's really defines what you perceive. It's like it goes hand in hand with the visuals. Sometimes you don't actually see the visuals clearly until there's sound to them, and of course, sound can also change what you literally think you're seeing through your eyes. So it's physically in our heads, that's how it's wired. So of course, it makes things more believable, and it's important. If you are a sound person or a sound designer, please enjoy it. It's a fantastic time to work in sound design.
You know, one thing that's super cool about you, Rachid, is that at the beginning you're maybe more like on a low tone and maybe more like reserved. But you can really tell that this is your passion, because the more you talk about it, the more you really like get into it. So really, thank you so much for sharing this with all of us, and also the way that you did. And okay, let's take one last question from Kenneth, which is asking, on which platform will you suggest a newbie from filmmaking background interested in creating interactive storytelling experiences start?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Well, really, I mean, partly it's, what's your passion? The problem of the platforms is a whole nother one that we could spend hours on. And I really think you start on the platform that you're most excited about, that is the most approachable to you from a technology perspective. So for people that like to film and they just want to play with 360 filming, and it's easier for them to experiment with, then that's where you start. Especially at the start, really you just need the first iteration. Everything is in iteration, and no first iteration is good at all. Maybe not even the 100th iteration is good. But as you go more and more, you'll start seeing sort of the limits of your platform, which doesn't mean it's bad necessarily. It just means it will guide you towards where you can go. As far as where people experience things, of course, right now we're mostly making things for each other at some level. 360 video had a giant peak. I don't know if it's still as common, but at least it's available, and you can put something together and send it to people all over the world, and there's players now available everywhere. Unfortunately, the moment you go into something that's more interactive, that doesn't really, I don't know of anything that exists yet that's that common, and that's one of the things we're working on as well, is this really complex issue of the platform. And so really if you're learning, you do things in whatever is the most comfortable to you. And it's really depending on where you are. If you're an engineer, of course, you're going for tech. If you are an artist, you go for art, and there's so many platforms to play with art. And if you're a storyteller, well, you go for storytelling, and there's so many ways to do it. It might not be even, some of your prototypes may not be even a video. I encourage people to just play with the story as much as they play with the technology. Play with the story as a group of friends sitting together around doing some immersive experience, and see, okay, if one of us plays the audience and sits in the middle, how is my actors going to act? How is my story going to play? Really play the story as a stagecraft, as a story, in the simplest medium you can do, because that's really what's missing, actually. There's a lot of tech, but there is a lot of missing sort of craft still that we're all learning in terms of how do you create stories that are interesting.
So my last question will be about one wish for the future, right? Let's envision the VR scene / industry 10 years from now.
I like 10 years.
Where would you like it to be?
10 years is great.
Actually, that was the question I posed in the second workshop you came and did a masterclass, which was called Stories for the Future 2030, which was looking into where are we going to be in 10 years from now. So I'm asking this question a year later, because I think it was around this time that we did the event in San Francisco. So now it's actually properly 2030, because at the time it was 11 years. So.
Yeah, no, 10 years is like no responsibility. I don't have to say anything exact. But I think in general, I think we are in a phase where it may be similar to where film was in the early 1900s, where tech was out. some level of it. Although early on, people made business with film tech, and we're kind of not there yet. But tech is there. People are playing with it. We're maybe in like the 30s or 40s where people were just making I'm not saying crappy in a sense, but they were making stuff, and there was so much stuff, and it had to do with use as much film tech as possible and do the most spectacular things as possible. And we're kind of in an open lab in VR, or all of these, what we call now XR, I guess. I'm hoping that we start seeing more and more ability for storytellers, filmmakers, people with interesting things to make and to tell, to play with, really. And that's my hope, and that's also kind of our passion in Haiba, is to produce things that would help with that. Things that will help people actually start playing with the concepts and start creating things and away from the headaches of technology. Because I feel like I know the tech is going to get there. People, most of the smart people are working on this stuff. They may be solving the wrong problems. That's okay. There's so many people working that we're going to get, whatever. We're going to get 4D video and 5D video, and we're going to get, touch and suits that we wear and all of this, and glasses and things in the eyes, all of that. My fear is that we get all of that and then we can't do anything with it because we don't know what to do with it. And I think this is the area where I saw the most need is really storytellers, artists with, people that can pull some of these texts towards them. It could be nothing spectacular, but it helps creating stories, discovering what does it mean and how do we do it and what's all the failures. And then by the time the tech is there, that we have a new craft, really. I mean, it's an extension of the same things we've been doing for years, but it's a new thing. And I'm not talking about, it's not about AI being so perfect. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I'm talking about just the tech being made for the people that will create art with it. That's the point. The tech is worthless without the art. And that's
actually,
my final word.
Actually, that was the whole premise behind Stories for the Future, which was tech. Once you have a vision and you know where you want to go, tech will follow and will get us where we want to go. But first, we must decide that place. Because otherwise, we're just going to end up in the wrong corner without knowing how. But anyways, thank you so much. I think I told you half an hour, and it's been already more than an hour. Really, thank you so much. This has been like super inspiring. Like every time I talk with you, like I have like these 1 million of ideas in my head. So really, thank you so much. And for anyone who's interested, we have translated some of the tools and practices and use cases and examples into a virtual format. So if you guys want to join, I think Peter and Niels from Virtual are offering a discount for all of you who join. So, and I think you will receive an email with all of this information. So again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And I think I'm going to go down and start writing some new stories.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys for the great questions. And
all right, thank you so much.
Thanks. All right, bye.